I've known you now for many years, and I've known you as an activist and an environmental colleague. And through that, I've seen a lot of the work you do, such as the Protected Area Update, which is basically chronicling stories about conservation, environmental issues from national parks around the country. And what struck me then about the Protected Area Update that I really see kind of coming out here is this interest in detailed stories and how these little bits of stories that come across from all over the world really tell us something about what's going on. And in some sense, I was curious whether this was and the outcome of your own sort of set of detailed stories and episodes from your time in the Andamans. And that's something I'm curious about. But I think when I read this book over the past 3-4 days, and 3 things really kind of stood out that I'm going to try and share with you without sounding like I'm a part of your fan club or something. The first is that, how immensely proud I am as a friend, but also really inspired as an environmental colleague to try and push myself to not only write and communicate academic issues in different ways, but also really think about these kinds of issues by putting myself in, really in other people's heads, so to speak, as you've done with these characters, So can I actually convey not only what these characters in this book think about the Andamans or the environment, but also their love lives, what's going on, and does all of that stuff really just tell me a much more wholesome picture? So I was really inspired that you were able to do that. Particularly because as we've been talking just a few minutes earlier, academics probably have the worst writing style ever. And, maybe social scientists are more guilty of it than others. And in that sense, I think this has been had a very important role to play. In some sense, my academic discipline is political ecology, and I felt actually what you've done is convey the political ecology of the Andamans without calling it political ecology or without calling it anthropology or any of that, which I think is just so much a nicer way of going about doing it. But also, of course, I haven't really been to the Andamans. I know of the issues there, but really this was, in that sense, the specialty of the place, I think also makes the book really unique. And my first kind of question was really about, can you actually tell us why the Andamans? I mean, you've worked in a number of different places, and what was it about the Andamans, the local setting? The book has no illustration, so what does it look like? What do these issues actually look like? And maybe that's a good starting point, and to try and open up sort of the conversation.
So what I can do maybe is briefly say how the book came to be, and then we have a little presentation which I can run you all through to give a little kind of visual sense of the place. And particularly for the IIHS, I thought some of the work that I've been doing as a researcher to understand what happened in the islands when the tsunami and the earthquake happened. Actually, there's a very interesting, we all know the place for the tsunami, but there's a very interesting kind of a parallel narrative of how to relook at what happened there and stuff like that. And it also kinds of...
the book ends.
The book ends with the tsunami. But what I'll do before that is just to answer the question in a sense, the book is an outcome in many ways of multiple streams of engagement with the islands. In one, it's a work of fiction, but it actually was an outcome or a response to a certain disappointment and even a frustration that I felt in the activism and the research and the journalism that I've been doing for the last 15-20 years where the Andamans are concerned. And there's a very specific account of that at some point which I can share in detail, where we've been involved in legal action in the Supreme Court. We have good orders by the court, but it doesn't get implemented. And it's really frustrating as a researcher, as an activist, that what more can one do? All court orders, or most court orders, are contested because there are claims of different kinds. But having said that, if there is a court order, why is it not implemented, kind of? So the challenge for me and the kind of trigger for me was to see, can I tell this multiple stories? So this is actually a book that is a story in the islands, but also it's a story actually about the islands. So the details that you speak about was also my kind of fascination with the place. Like I think most of us would get involved in place. You work in Coorg, so I'm sure the last 4 or 5 years of you've learned so much about the place. You become involved in different ways. It could be different for all of us. So for me, it's now been a 20-year journey with the islands and in the islands. So there were these multiple streams of information. There's the anthropology of the place. There's a very fascinating history of the place. There are the issues on the environmental front. There's the fascinating ecology of the place. And one ends up either as a researcher or as an academic, which I've not been much. I've become one more recently, or as a journalist. One ends up writing about those themes. So one can write non-fiction, perhaps, as an anthropological account or as a historical account. But what I think fiction allows or allowed me to do was to try and weave them all together, because there are such interesting nuggets and streams of information and histories and narratives. So that was also the details, but also to try and weave it in. And at the center of the book is this Jarawa community, in a sense, which perhaps some of you know about. And it again is a complex story to just kind of tell straight away or straight off. But in some senses, one got involved in the activism around their rights with very strong questioning of who are you to speak on behalf of A community or B community, etc., etc. But having resolved that in our own way or personally, one trigger, and I mention that and then go on to the presentation, is when the earthquake and the tsunami of 2004 happened, there was huge destruction, as we all know, in the islands. And of course, there was a lot of damage, lots of lives lost, property lost. But the Jarawas, for instance, were not affected at all, because it's a small community, and for no reason, like some have argued that they had some knowledge of the wave coming and stuff like that. Nothing of that sort. How much ever we might like to believe, because sometimes we want to romanticize that body of knowledge. But and of course there's no denying the kind of knowledge they have. But just for the sheer reason that they are forest-dwelling communities that live somewhat upland. So they're never going to be affected by a tsunami because they're not on the coast. Unlike what happened in the Nicobars, where maximum casualties took place, they are coastal communities. So on the one hand, there's this huge event of phenomenal nature of magnitude and energy and destruction that causes so much of loss. And the community that is actually the most vulnerable is not affected at all. So when I came back on one of the trips back from the island, there was this sense of one tsunami having come and gone, one big physical tsunami. But if actually you look at the history of indigenous communities, it's almost like the history is one slow, insidious, unforgiving, unending tsunami that just goes on and on and on. And how to tell that story? So there is that metaphorical wave. The last wave is the real wave, but there's also this historical kind of thing that is there. So that was a kind of trigger also to try and tell the story, in addition to the frustration and the disappointment of sorts that one felt. So let me then kind of share with you some of the, let's go back. Just put on. No, this, yeah, now. Yeah. So maybe I should just stand somewhere and I'll use this one to use the pointer. Would that be okay? Yeah. So just quickly, I'm going to take only 10 minutes to run you through. So just a quick kind of geography. Of course, these are the Andaman and Nicobar Islands with a 10-degree latitude, which is what's also known as a 10-degree channel. This is the southern tip, about 6.5 degrees north latitude. Burma and Sumatra, Madras, Port Blair has come wrongly in the slide. Vizag and Calcutta as the three most prominent kind of gateways to the islands. Roughly 1,200 to 1,400 kilometers from Port Blair, which is roughly here. And just as a marker, the star here roughly, not very accurately, is the epicenter of the earthquake of December 2004 that caused a gigantic tsunami that hit South and Southeast Asia. Just a closer look at the picture. Again, so the Little Andaman being the southernmost of the Andaman group. And it's believed that the islands are actually the peaks of a submerged mountain range known as the Arakanyoma, that goes down in an arc from Burma in the north to Sumatra in the south. It is a fascinating place by itself, of course, with various multiple interests, particularly from an ecological kind of, geological kind of context. Also because they are the peaks, like I said, of a submerged mountain range in an area, as we all know, tremendous tectonic activity. I think the zone 5, which is the most active. So an example of an island, and you can make out why it's, very rocky cliffs, spectacular sandy beaches. You have here a kind of littoral forest of pandanus, and it's a really small island. This must be half a square kilometer of an island, and some of the diptocarp species that you will find in a typical ecological system. Another picture from a little island known as South Sentinel, uninhabited island, just 1.5 square kilometers, reasonably flat, unlike most in the Andaman group. But just I thought it's an interesting, so the pristine ocean, the white sandy beaches, which are very important turtle nesting sites, and of course, rich evergreen forests. Another cross section, say, of an Andaman forest, right from at low tide the mangroves, then you have the pandanus and the littoral forest, and then this is gurjan, the diptocarp species that shoots up in the canopy of a rainforest, and one of the dominant species in the Andaman Islands. Some examples. This is a book this is a orchid called Vanda teres or Papillonanthe teres, which also appears on the cover of the book. And if some of you have read the book, or hopefully will read, it plays a very important role in the story in the book, which is based on ecological information, but also has been worked upon. And there is also subversive botanist in the book. So that's an interesting. A friend of mine was very intrigued to hear the term how can a botanist be subversive, but maybe they can be. So this is a very interesting flower. Plant, because it's a sun-loving orchid, so it doesn't grow in the canopy of a rainforest. So it will only grow where the canopy has been opened up. It likes direct sunlight, so could be possibly an interesting ecological indicator when we look at ecosystems. Another fascinating bird down south in the extreme south of the Nicobar Islands, known as the Nicobari megapode, which is an endemic, and it's a bird, just quickly, that does not build a nest as they normally build. What you can see here is actually the tip of a mound of earth, which is about this big, that the bird has scraped up with its feet, and they make a mound of earth for the nest, and they lay the eggs inside that mound of earth, and they don't incubate it. It just kind of incubates by the energy and the heat generated by the sun and the rotting, decaying matter. So, and then the chicks are precocious. They kind of run after their mother and father after they're born. So one of the kind of iconic endemic species in the Nicobar Islands. A mangrove ecosystem, which is such a crucial and a critical ecosystem on the coastline. Very interesting ecologically, because the adaptations that mangroves have to deal with that very dynamic and complex system. Here, and I'm just going to assume that I know a little more here, so I'm just going to say a few things which I'm sure all of you all know as well. But breathing roots as one adaptation, where actually what's propping up from the soil here is roots that help the plant breathe, because otherwise the soil is so saturated with water that the plant finds it difficult to breathe where the roots are concerned. In the mangrove kind of forest, all kinds of species, of course. This is what's known as a fiddler crab. And fiddler because of the fiddler on the roof, this arm over here, this kind of big claw it kind of keeps going like this. It's almost like somebody playing the violin. So it's both, and it only the male has it, so it's kind of attracting females and also warding off other males, territorial displays. One of the most spectacular things in the islands are the turtles that come to nest on the beaches. It's an incredible experience to be on a dark night on an isolated beach and see these very magnificent creatures come and nest. But very important in the context of also the long-term survival of these species. There are 4 species of sea turtles that nest in the Andaman Islands, Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And then, of course, there is the marine life, the coastal systems, and the coral reefs. This is a giant clam embedded in the architecture of a coral reef, the bivalve. And coming to kind of what has been typically the development trajectory. And this is a 1998 picture, and this is a full-grown elephant. So you can make out what the girth and the kind of magnitude of the tree would have been. We tend to kind of dismiss and have a value judgment on forestry and stuff like that today. But if you look at the trajectory of development and stuff like that, In the 60s and 70s, it might have been just the right thing to do. When forests were looked at differently, indigenous peoples, wildlife was looked at very differently. So it's part of that. Each one has their own kind of complex narratives and stories, which are presentations and discussions by themselves. But just to give you a sense of what it is, and this happens much less now. But I think if I'm not mistaken, between the 60s and the 80s, huge tracts of forest, pristine evergreen forests, were cleared in the Andaman Islands in manners like this and otherwise to create settlements for people that came from mainland India. And that story appears in some ways in the book as well. But these were also, just as a quick footnote, a lot of them were what is now Bangladesh, what was then East Pakistan. And the refugees that were running away from what was happening there, there was a chunk of these people that were encouraged to go to the islands with promises of resources, which they were given land and homesteads and timber. And what else could they do but clear forests for their homesteads, their houses, for their agriculture, for their horticulture? But this has been considerable amount of things that happen. It's much less now, but that, and to some extent it does happen even today. I mean, just a picture of that, what that forest might be once it's cleared up. And just to mention that this is all primarily territory and the livelihood base of the indigenous communities like the Jarawa and the Onge, which are also at the heart of the book and some of the key controversies that have been there. One of which is this Andaman Trunk Road, which is again at the heart of the book, but also at the heart of what I was mentioning initially of the controversy in the Supreme Court and the non-implementation of court orders and stuff like that. And this is a kind of series of pictures that I got in 2003, which again appears very strongly in the book. There's a fictionalized version of that story. And this incident where something is exchanged between the Jarawa woman and the bus driver appears in the book as well, on the Andaman Trunk Road, for instance. So just to give you a sense of the space and some of the issues. And now quickly to come to, so in that context, with this background, so to say, this is a kind of a graphic of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands post the tsunami or immediately after December 2004, based on a map that was generated by a bunch of geologists at the University of Colorado, Dr. Roger Billam and his team. They kind of studied some of the changes that took place, and the figures in red are something I'd just like you to kind of quickly note. -4, +1, +1, -1 kind of thing. And I'll come back to this slide shortly. And here is what I want to really kind of point out to. So we have in the islands, now if you look at these figures in black, this is in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, roughly about, put together about 8,000 square kilometers of total area of the Andaman and Nicobar, split between the Andamans at 6,400 and 1,800 at, so the red is percentages. 77% of the land in this entire island belongs to the Andamans, 20% is in the Nicobars. Population as per the 2001 census, 88% of the population is in the Andamans, 12% of the population in the Nicobars. So proportionally, it's very clear where the land is, where the people are. But if you look at what happened in the islands, in terms of the disaster, in terms of the loss of life and loss of property that took place, it's almost drastically inversely proportional. So where you had 78% of the population in the islands, only 2% of the people dead and missing in the tsunami, roughly 3,500 people. 98% of the people come from 20% of the population. Similarly with livestock loss, agricultural land loss. So, it's almost like lesser the land, the more the damage that's taken place. And say housing and stuff like that. So it actually doesn't match up because the tsunami was the big wave that on the mainland coast we had so much damage. And what really explains that, and in some senses the book ends up reifying that idea, but it is not just the tsunami that caused the damage. It was a combination of the earthquake and the tsunami. And this is what actually happened, is from what we can gather, is that in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, there was tremendous tectonic shift in the lay of the islands, with parts of the Nicobar, like in the southern tip, actually seeing a permanent submergence of 4 meters. And parts of the Andamans taking a kind of permanent uplift of about 1 to 2 meters. And then, of course, there were maybe the smaller faults and stuff like that. So you have, And there's also a north-south shift, and there was also a west-east kind of shift. So the west kind of came up, the east went under a bit, and then there was, so we had, submergence are here, you have uplift here, you have uplift here, you have submergence here, you have uplift here. So there are multiple kind of faults that have played a role, but this is what kind of explains what happened, and it's not so much the tsunami alone. And there's a paper that I also have in the Journal of the BNHS that goes into the entire dynamics of what I believe happened. And from anecdotal accounts, we seem to see that this movement, the shift, may have taken place even before the big waves of the tsunami came. So it's almost like, so if a tsunami was to come, it would retreat. There would not be permanent submergence. That would only happen if there was, there would not be loss of land unless there was permanent submergence. And the sense is that this might have happened even before the waves actually came. So the people in the Nicobars, who are the tribal communities who are primarily coastal dwelling, were in line of threat much more, and were even more threatened because of this kind of shift that took place. And that, in my understanding, really explains this huge kind of disproportionate damage that kind of took place. And there's some interesting, so this is what I mean. Now this is a picture just of the west coast of an island called Interview Island, which, as the researchers have said from some kind of modeling and perhaps even more than that, is about 1 to 2 meters of uplift. And this is a picture taken just 2 months after the tsunami, when I was on a survey with a bunch of researchers, and you can actually correlate and see this at the background. This is a 180-degree kind of stitched picture of 12 images, and the background is what you can see is what one might say the old Interview Island, and you can see this entire coral reef patch, which is a closer version. What is permanently underwater, coral has to be permanently underwater, is now permanently above water. And this porritus, which is the coral reef, these are boulders of about 3 to 4 feet in height. So when we walked it, they were about this height. So it really correlates, and you can see that this, in a sense, did happen. And this particular patch was estimated to be about 20-25 square kilometers of the land that had just come up. So you have an entire new configuration of the coastline, so to say. And this is a closer picture of that one, and you can see the kind of uplift. And now this is the picture that explains. Now this is satellite imagery. This is December 21, just like 3 days before, and this is December 26, the day actually of that earthquake. And this is of the island of Kachal, where some of the maximum damage and destruction and loss of life took place. And this really explains to you what I've been saying. You see the circles in yellow, and you see the red masses of land, which are now completely underwater. The same with this little island of Trinket, which is in that same middle Nicobar group of the Nankauri group of islands. This island actually is believed to have split up, figuratively speaking, into 3, where the low-lying parts of the islands then were completely underwater. So it's useful and important to understand that this was a dynamic that took place, rather than just making it a tsunami narrative, in a sense. This is a picture closer up of Port Blair I showed you in the Andaman part. What was completely paddy fields earlier, and you can see actually the mangrove creeks here, because of that 1 meter submergence, is now a complete sheet of water. And now if you go there, it's even because all this mangrove has died and is kind of collapsed into the water, so it's one sheet of water. And what was very interesting immediately after the tsunami was that the best prawn that people in Port Blair ate for a long time was immediately after the tsunami. And it was coming from this wetland, because what was a paddy field now was perhaps very good feedstock for prawn for a short bit of period. And now it's not there anymore. And there were similarly other interesting small ecological changes that also took place in many other places that we know of, and many that we don't know of. And this is a similar situation, but down south in the Nicobars. So if you go up, you can see this entire forest, coastal forest, some coconut plantations. This is mangrove forest, some supari, areca plantations. All what was green earlier, because of permanent submergence and permanently being underwater, have died and have now become kind of brown, so to say. And from the other side, from the seaside, this is what that coastline looked for a long time. So when we went to the Nicobars in the initial years, many of these islands were surrounded by this wall of brown, because trees were now permanently submerged and were slowly dying, and that's also changing now. So that's really the kind of, in very brief, what happened. And I will take this opportunity to also move into the book, back again into the book, by reading for you the epigraph of what the book is, and it'll contextualize this little presentation of what happened in the Andamans, and also lay out the book for you. This is an account from a book called The History of Our Relations with the Andamanese by this anthropologist and Britisher called M.B. Portman. It was written in 1899. It's one of the standard references where the Andamans are concerned. So M.B. Portman was a fellow of the University of Calcutta, and in Port Blair he had been given charge of the Andamanese. So he was what was known as the officer in charge of the Andamanese. And this is a really small extract from his 2-volume account, where he narrates a story that he is told about the Andamans by the Andamanese themselves. The Andamanese is another tribal community similar to the Jarawas that have inhabited this place for a very long time. It's called The Great Cataclysm, written in 1899 based on what the Andamanese have told Portman. All Andamanese tradition dates back to some great cataclysm which submerged a greater part of the land. The Andamanese say that before this cataclysm, they were all one tribe and spoke the same language, but that after it, the survivors became separated into tribes, their languages gradually differed, until at last they became mutually unintelligible as at present. It is quite possible that the tradition may be an account of what occurred when, by subsidence, the Andamans were cut off from the mainland of the Arakan, which is the northern part. And though geologists are slow to allow of sudden convulsions, yet it is certain that the subsidence, whether sudden or gradual, did take place. A general gradual subsidence ending in a severe earthquake, which lowered a large tract of land a few feet and thus submerged a considerable area, might be sufficient to account for this tradition. It is curious that, though there are no wild beasts larger than a pig at the Andamans now, excepting reptiles and marine mammals, the Andamanese state that large and fierce beasts, as well as many aborigines, were drowned in the cataclysm. And even in the Little Andaman, the people have names for animals which they cannot describe, but evidently have traditions of. Whatever value we may attach to these legends, however, one thing seems certain, namely that the Andamanese have inhabited these islands in their present state for a period which can only be considered by thousands of years, and they antedate any history or record preserved among these people. What I found absolutely fascinating about this account is it could well be an account of what happened in 2004, when by subsidence and loss of land and loss of people and loss of habitat. So it obviously is how these islands have come to be, earthquakes and it's one of the most active places in the universe. So I use this to set the book as well, and I just thought it would be a nice transition to kind of go back in history, but also come looking ahead of this is how the islands happened, and maybe the Andamanese actually telling us a story of something that will keep happening. So thank you so much, and maybe you should just read you have the back of the book of what the story is about, so that you'll have read. Thank you. Yes. Please come. Yes.
I mean, the most obvious question I had was, then why does the book end in the tsunami? Why not? Why after?
The book was written immediately after the tsunami. I finished writing the book in 2006, 2007. It just took that long to find a publisher. And it was a bit of a struggle, and I didn't have the heart and the energy to.
Right.
And I had told that story, so one can always, it's endless.
Yeah.
How much you stretch it into the history or into the future, in a sense. But this, in a sense, was the story at that point of time that I kind of wanted to tell. And I mean, actually, I might just, I just leave it at that. And I'll come back to this map at some point, depending on how the conversation goes. So this is what is known as the Jarawa Tribal Reserve, which is at the heart of what the book is in some senses, but also at one of the kind of pivots of the work that we've been doing in the Andaman Islands. Yeah.
So, I mean, most of my questions revolve around this broad idea of activism and storytelling, and perhaps you all might have similar questions and issues as well. I'm really curious about a number of things about the process of writing this. The first one being, in some ways, it's a very productive outcome of a lot of the frustration and anger that you had from working there and, doing your campaigns and so on. I mean, a lot of us who do research, Venkat, you and I have chatted so much, is that we come out feeling hopeless and without words. And in some sense, how does the process, how was it, how have you been able to be productive in some sense?
See, like I said, it's a response to some of the, and also, like I've been discussing all over, that there are lots of ambivalences in the book, which is much less than what my personal position would be. But when one engages in some sense and if one is open to looking at multiple perspectives, one realizes that there is a lot more than what just we say. And I think if you're open to looking at the other perspective and looking at, so like I've been saying, in a sense, all characters in the book, at some point or the other, make a compromise. So there's nobody who can really take a moral high stand or a moral high ground and say, I'm right and I did it right. Because the world isn't like this. And that perhaps is a journey that maybe age, maybe experience, maybe graying hair, maybe the realization that you can only do that much in a particular kind of, and also a kind of, we had a discussion in A3 the other day, and somebody asked, how do you keep having hope? And I actually ended up saying, at some point you have to stop caring. And that's not a, that's not a very nice thing to say. But what I realized as an afterthought, what I was also meaning is to say, is how to figure out at an individual level what to continue to hold on to and what to let go. Because the moment, and it's not easy, I guess. So, because if we have to emotionally and personally sustain ourselves, then some things we have to, as individuals, we keep doing that all the time. But the moment we let go something, which is never easy, one does not feel so compelled by it. And in some senses, the book is about letting go of some things in a way, of not being just about the Jarawa, or, I mean, who am I to talk about the Jarawa anyway? But also to realize that there is another side to the story where the activism or the interest of the Jarawa does come in conflict with another set of people. And that all of us as research, I mean, the book is full of characters who are researchers. I mean, it's about, and that is the entry point into the story. Which is so close to what I do, or that's the milieu I know best. But we all know that we make our compromises. And we can't, so there's the front stage and the so-called the backstage. And these are sometimes productive compromises, sometimes we want to protect ourselves. So how do you just kind of let go and explore all of that?
But why write a novel and not a book of essays?
I think the one is that the novel allows for telling things that you can't say, because then it becomes about people, about individuals, if that is the case. But it is not so much about a particular individual. It's about what we do as humans, if for want of a better word, so to say. And I think a novel at two levels. I think it allows for as a form, because it's fiction. It allows larger possibilities of interweaving multiple narratives, more than perhaps a bunch of essays or stuff like that. And then at one level, I think also the ambition and aspiration of wanting to be a novelist. I mean, like I said, everybody's writing a novel, so I also want to write a novel kind of thing. And so there is that aspirational space, ambitional space that you want to explore. So it's a combination of, and it is an interesting creative journey, so to say.
Okay, I mean, the other kind of question that I had related to this was asking you really about what you felt might the purpose of this novel be. In some sense, what did you want the reader to feel at the end of it? Because I thought a lot about how I felt at the end of it. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, what did you want the reader to feel?
No, I don't think I thought about that at all. Also, when we do projects and proposals, so what's the target audience? And I find it very difficult to, in any kind of work, to identify a target audience and stuff like that. So it really, I think in that sense, it was a selfish endeavor. It was a story I needed to tell. And at that point, I don't even know if it's going to be published. I mean, there is a great ambition and the hope. But, unknown novelist or unknown writer and a debut novel. So, in a sense, in one sense, was also a kind of a catharsis, so to say,
Sure,
at
exactly.
multiple levels to
Yeah.
tell the story which otherwise
Yeah.
you don't want to say. And what I wanted the book to do, like I said, was to tell a story, explore my own capacities as a storyteller, as information sharing, but tell the story of the islands, and in the islands, what the reader will feel and what I wanted the reader to kind of feel, I have no sense. And what's interesting is, when we released the book in Hyderabad, there is this friend of mine who's a very prominent publisher of Telugu literature called Geeta Ramaswamy, very well known in some circles as an activist and agricultural rights person. And she publishes publishes offbeat and the non-published kind of stuff in Telugu. And she said something very interesting, which might be such an obvious. She said, as a writer, Pankaj, you don't own the word anymore. Readers make what they make of what you write. You can't own it anymore. So, not that I thought about it earlier, but I don't think really one might want the reader to feel something, but it just doesn't work that way. People have read it already in so many different ways that I am completely blown away by how people relate to it, what they make of it, how they interpret it. So it's just such a fascinating. So every conversation like this one, I've had 2 or 3. At one level, it's exhausting, it's a little tiring. But on the other, because each individual, each person in conversation brings his and her own understanding that it can just take on a completely new meaning.
But I mean, I think my question was also kind of, did you start out wanting to write a fiction novel, or was it in some ways you felt a useful medium to communicate issues in some sense?
I think both. I think both. I wanted to do, like all of us, wanted to do many things in my life. Writing a novel was never on that list. It kind of just happened. And also kind of must mention, and I've also said it publicly, is that one trigger for the book, in a sense, was when I read The Hungry Tide by Amitav Ghosh, which I'm assuming some of you have read. And it was, in some senses, this is a similar story, because about a particular ecosystem, a set of people. So when I read The Hungry Tide, actually on the way back from the islands after the tsunami, I still remember sitting on Chennai airport and reading that book. And it just kind of clicked in my mind then. I kind of still remember that setting. I know where I was sitting even, although Chennai airport has changed now. I have a image in my mind of the sofa that I was sitting on and reading. That, yes, I mean, if this can be a story, then maybe there can be a story in the Andamans about the Andamans. So that's why, in a sense,
But did your previous research work, and I'm sure the collection of all the field notes and field books and so on, become a sort of referring point back to...
Absolutely. I mean, it is inspired by people I know, characters, my own personal experience, my diary notes. All of that comes in. So it adds an element of interesting authenticity on the one hand. And sometimes it also becomes a little problematic, because then people are asking, there's so much non-fiction in this, then why didn't you just write a non-fiction account? And the slippages between reality, and people are trying to identify which guy is Pankaj and which guy is the researcher, and whom are you married to, and is that girl in the picture, that kind of thing. This thing is there. Did you
I mean, I wasn't convinced that it was a novel. I thought it should have been memoir or autobiography or whatever. And in related to that, I was really curious, I mean, about your decision to not write it from first person. I mean, instinctively, that's what I think I would have done. I would have described my process and experience, saying, I felt this, whatever, and maybe fictionalized it. But in some sense, the sort of conscious effort to write it from third person, I thought was quite interesting.
And the other kind of, which I think relates to this, the other key concern for me when I was writing the book was, this is not activism or journalism, this is a novel. So there was this very acute effort and awareness. So there's one thing that I really put an effort into, was to, in a sense, distance myself from the activism in the story. And fortunately, it is still there. So I've been in conversations, and I've been saying, I've tried to make it neutral, I've tried to give everybody's story, it's not an activist account, etc., etc. And friends have asked, you're almost sounding apologetic, and what are you apologetic about? And in any case, your politics comes out in the book. So what are you apologizing about? And I'm so grateful in that sense. But that trajectory is there. So in some senses, maybe subconsciously, the third person might have been an effort at distancing oneself. in a way from there. With activism, like I said, didn't was a kind of a little bit of a dead end, little bit, not entirely. Was a disappointment with that. So it's an extension and a skirting of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, sorry,
Yeah,
you have a question?
maybe we can also.
Please, yeah.
So, can you like answer what's going on in my head? Very clear that use the word catastrophe, but it will wait for you to do some kind of sense making of your own life and experience and keep and I can kind of understand that why you would use fiction as a medium because it allows you to take liberties if you want. But and you did say that it was not really meant. You didn't think of the reader, but not specific to this novel, but since you said that activism was a dead end and then you chose fiction and your politics come through, do you think that there is something that this form of a novel or a short story or any kind of fiction offers something that an academic or even a journalistic account, do you think this travels more widely, does it have more impact? And is it a good medium to convey politics through? Not just
I think it's a very interesting point, and I had a very interesting experience recently. But what I also think is that why just restrict it to what value it has for our activism or our academics? Why can't it just be a good story that like we read any? So I mean, there's enough value in that also. If one kind of so having put caveat, because what's happening for me is also I also want it to be evaluated and read as a good story. Of course, one can't escape the context. And there was an interesting review in the Biblio recently, where the reviewer actually says that he's perhaps read my other work. So he says the book cannot be separated from the author and its context, and that is perhaps both the strength and the weakness. So it's like it doesn't say anything, but it's both things. So, but having said that, the experience this time in the island was absolutely quite mind blowing. I was there about a week ago, 10 days ago, where we released the book. Friends there. It's been amazingly well received in the island. It's sold a number of copies. People are reading it. They're referring it to others. They're buying it for their friends in the island. And what is actually done, and what the sense I'm getting is, because of having presented various perspectives, even what might be considered a perspective that did not agree with what we were saying as an activist, is a lot more sympathetic to what you are now saying. Because there's a conversation. There is an engagement where you are seeing what I am saying, and I am forced to see what you are saying. And in that process, almost of a transaction or a negotiation, it seems to, at least in some cases, with friends and their friends telling them that, we understand the situation much better now, and we are willing to change our perspective on a particular issue. Now, what it might lead to in terms of on the ground is a different matter, and that really was not the aim of the book for me. But it was quite stunning. I was quite stunned to get that kind of a feedback to somebody saying, we agree with you on that position because you have now articulated our point of view. And I did that also because, not for that purpose, but like I said earlier, we just have so much diversity even in our own personal lives and professional lives. And just a few things get portrayed. So this allows for, so in that sense, I think it does help because it can be a political, it is, writing is, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and I love fiction, so I'm not saying that I completely agree when you say a good story has value in itself. I think my point was, I guess, it's not just direct impacts, but like what your friend said, that people read so much today. But I feel that's not necessarily true. There are still very deep silences about lots of things, So Andaman is one of them. You probably go to other tribal areas. You are. So I meant that the thing was I think that probably something like The Hungry Tide or this book, it just travels more widely. So I was not directly saying that it will make an impact on the ground, but it just, closes some of the silences, which
I think so, yes. Yeah, please.
For me, I'm a filmmaker, I'm personally a little uncomfortable. I want to read a book about this whole question of looking at the idea of form as a medium. Because form is not medium. Form is very related to the idea itself. And for me personally, whether you write an essay, or you write a novel, or you make a non-fiction film or a fiction film, they would all be the same theme. And I'm not answering your question, but this whole thing of Why is it that when you write a novel or a short story, it may have a certain kind of circulation, as opposed to when you write an academic paper, that also very deeply entrenched in the questions of hierarchy of knowledge, or what academic writing itself thinks it is and how it's circulated. I think it may also sort of, I to some extent lie there, but I do want to read your book and are you selling copies?
Yes, there are copies at the back. They are available.
You know what I felt really strongly, just as a story, I felt, we try and do a number of things, and you've written newspaper articles and filed petitions in the Supreme Court and so on, and there's still that sense of silence or lack of attention or voice that a lot of people had. And I thought, you can write a journal, a newspaper article, and it takes what people 10 minutes to read. And in some sense, I thought, hey, I'm going to make you sit down with my book for 2 days. And in that sense, you're actually with and in the Andamans for 2 days. And that in itself, I thought, was really powerful and quite political.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think I fully agree, because there are so many silent spaces. I mean, I think there's more silent space than noise, and and it's actually noise about so many things that we here might consider so peripheral and so fluffy. Look at what our newspapers are reporting about, and everything does not have to be about issues. And of course, but certain quality, certain depth, certain sensibilities are missing, I think. So I think there's potential everywhere, and I agree. But somewhere also the medium is the message. It's like, and it's about the politics, not just of the hierarchy, but also of the politics of the form. So the form, I think the content is important, but I wouldn't at one level also, I mean, the form itself is the content sometimes, in the way it reaches out. So there's I think a larger dynamic and an iteration almost there, where some things can be said, some things can't be said. And I fully agree about the hierarchy of knowledge and what will reach where. But in some senses, I think this kind of form reaches out for various reasons. I mean, in a particular way that other forms don't, but then that can be said of all kinds of forms of communication. A film reaches out in a way that a novel cannot, or a piece of journalism reaches out in a way that an academic paper cannot. So each one has its own spaces, and it's not, I wouldn't say one is better than the other, it just reaches differently. Mm-hmm. No, please go ahead. They need the sound.
No. I was just saying that the idea of the novel itself, there's a way you imagine, right? Okay, if you write an academic paper, if you have a pamphlet, that's more political than writing a novel.
Right,
but
right.
Whether you choose to or not, I mean, a lot of Edward Said's work novel is as much a political thing, and that's why, I mean, my thing of my own personal thing is, let's not get too whatever about why do you choose to write the way you write, because there's a reason. And anyway,
I think when you say it's a novel, it's more of a branding, more of commercial purpose. I was actually looking for the glowing coal, if I should find it there in your presentation. The other thing, you said you started writing during the tsunami, before, after. Now that you went back to the island 10 days ago, my interest is, yes, there is more of non-fiction in the book than the fiction. What happens to the administration? Do they still say there is more of Jarawa sighting? Mm-hmm. Is it still there? Has the mindset changed since then? Have we been able to do that? Or are the Jarawas still, something that people from other countries come and enjoy?
It's actually a very difficult question to answer, because Jarawas are changing so rapidly. I mean, it's like shifting, the ground is shifting under the feet so rapidly that this book is almost, the story of the Jarawa here is almost not relevant in a sense, if you look at what's happening on the ground. So that's, I was also I got some insights into what they are doing now. And for example, alcohol has got into them big way. So, things like that and that's That, in a sense, I think is the luxury of a novel, if I might use the word, and the challenge for activism, because you have to be thinking on your feet if you have to be effective activist, because one has to recalibrate one's positions if we have to articulate, particularly if it's a fast changing situation, which a novel can be set in time and one can imagine and romanticize, and which all, of course, I guess we need to do. But the challenge, so that's the kind of shift that's taken place. What should be the activist position on the beginning from which again and again the book kind of fictionalizes events, beginning to a time when they were extremely hostile and not allowing any contact, or there always was contact but not allowing contact from a particular perspective, to now full integration, so to say, of a particular kind, and alcohol and stuff like that. So the answer to I won't be able to answer that question. One can answer it in the sense of what's happening and what's not happening, but what is the larger trajectory? What is the larger question? Is something. And can I just take the opportunity also of reading that glowing coals kind of it's a slightly longish passage in the beginning of the book.
I was actually also thinking about on page 237. I thought that sort of in some sense is about what you were just talking about. How would the Jarawa negotiate with the soil?
Okay, that's also. But can we? Let me read another small passage, because let's move away from the activism and the Jarawas to something else that's what's a little more hopeful, a little more enjoyable. No, I know.
For many of us who didn't take the islands beyond the history
Yes.
book, I remember Southgate and Brett just about a footnote. But when we started reading it, and it was like going back. It's just a dot in the map.
Yes.
But when you go to Cellular jail, when you connect with Syed Iqbal and Lalita, I think that's when you actually connect, and that's right at the beginning of the book. So you actually connect very well with the book. Then onwards, although as I said, there's more of non-fiction than fiction, but I think it connects very well with the people who don't know much about the island, because at least there is some connect with the Cellular jail, the mangroves, the creeks. These are the things that come back.
Right. Well, let me read. There's something on page 119, which is a short para on what many of us would like to do and what the islands also are about. This is actually an account of a part. So this map here is what I said was the heart. So this book is actually, in a sense, a journey around this physical space, in one sense, which is the Jarawa Tribal Reserve. So the key characters in the book, along with some other important characters, do one side of the journey by boat. So you have the experience of what a boat journey would be, what researchers do, the landscape, the history is woven in, and then there's another journey which is the journey on the contentious road, where the kind of conflicts also then come out. And this passage that I'm going to read is when these researchers take off on this boat and get onto the sea, and what do they experience as what is some of the things that we really love about the island. So it's a small passage of journey on the boat when they have kind of started, and there is a reference here to something called the Kirloskars, which is basically the engines of which are running the boat, which is the dungi, which is the local name for a country-made boat. So this is when they take off early morning. The gentle mist of the morning had cleared, and a little fishing boat was just about visible on the horizon. So this is like right here, so you can imagine a bit, maybe, hopefully. A moist, invigorating breeze caressed the faces of the occupants of the dungi as it simultaneously cut through the waters below and the air above. The sea was itself calm, a sheet of thick, fluid glass, so clear you could see down to the very bottom of the yet shallow ocean floor. The dungi was moving forward with purposeful linearity. The water below bobbed up and down, and patches of colorful coral in all sorts of shapes and sizes and forms passed quickly by. Tropical fish, big and small, painted as if by a child exuberant with a newly discovered palette, darted in and out of the coral architecture, some in groups and others in solitary exploration. It took a few moments for Seema's untrained eyes to settle into the ocean's complex rhythms. Harish and Seema were both bent on either side of the dungi, peering intently, enthralled by the wonders passing below them. They looked up at each other, shared excited smiles, and quickly turned back to the waters, like little children, not wanting to miss even an instant of this visual treat. Their eyes were immediately drawn to a smooth, linear movement in the depths ahead. For a moment, it looked like the shadow of their own vessel. In the next moment, it was a mystery transformed. Out of the literal blue, unaware and oblivious of the mysteries and love it inspires in the humans it shares the world with, a dolphin emerged from the deep and swam alongside Seema for a few seconds. Dolphin, she shrieked. Nothing could have prepared her for this moment. The dolphin skimmed along just under the surface of the water, keeping pace with the Kirloskars. The morning light passed through the waves, making abstract white patterns on the dark body of infinite elegance. The beautiful creature swam along for a short while with silken grace and then broke through the water surface, emerging for a few moments. Gliding along in the country boat, Seema was within touching distance. She only just resisted a desire to reach out and caress the glistening animal. The dolphin continued to swim with them, propelling itself effortlessly over the shoals of tropical fish and the coral. Then, with an imperceptible twitch of its tail, like an accomplished ballerina at the height of a performance, the dolphin switched to the other side of the dungi and swam alongside Harish for a while. Harish was no less ecstatic, only his nature did not allow him Seema's liberal expressions. He watched transfixed as the dolphin emerged again from the water for a few fleeting moments, dived back in, and then disappeared from view just as quickly as it had appeared. A small vignette of also what the islands are about. And maybe,
I'm still keen on that.
which one?
Well,
You said
there's a
two.
question, yeah, 237. It was really about
Yeah. Starting which, like, you have, okay. Okay, this is a kind of account where Harish, the key character, is thinking about the Jarawa, and it's not a very short one, so in the middle of page 236. The fate of the Jarawa, as he could see, had been sealed. This is after he's done this journey along the Andaman Trunk Road, and he's come to realize that this is, in some senses, is a big problem. And he wondered if there was anything he could do about it. All he had learned of the Jarawa was from the fringes of their lives, society, and land, from the people occupying these fringes and the changing landscape around their forests. So just as a little, what I try to, this book is actually about interfaces and fringes. It does not actually enter into the lives. So the idea is also, if you want to know the Jarawa, you can't know them from themselves. So can we know them from the people around them? Almost like images, like there's a term anamorphic images. You construct the story of these inaccessible people through the images of what is around them. So that's what this is a kind of reflection of. All he had learned of the Jarawa was from the fringes of their lives, society, and land, from the people occupying these fringes and the changing landscape around these forests. The fringe was now threatening to overwhelm the core. The original people were on their way to becoming the had-beens. Something has to be done about this, he thought. Something can be done. He didn't know what the Jarawa wanted, but did it matter? There was a fundamental reality to be acknowledged, that the Jarawa could not be asked, at least not for now. There was no language for that. The world around the Jarawa, that of the settlers, the outsiders, was itself changing so rapidly that it too was bewildered. It had been trying in its own way to deal and engage with the Jarawa, with their much smaller and more intimate and ancient world, one that was mysterious and unwilling to yield with ease. Two worlds existed alongside each other, but they inhabited time zones and realities so distinct they could have been on different planets. There was little, if anything at all, in common. When one did not even know how to communicate with the other, where was the question of a fair negotiation? How would the Jarawa negotiate with this world? Harish had asked Seema on the bus journey back. This, he now realized, was not about the Jarawa anymore. It had perhaps never been about them. It was about him and the world that he came from. How could this world negotiate fairly with the Jarawa? That was the question, and therein lay the challenge. Did it have the inclination? Did it even have the capacity and the understanding? The world that he belonged to the world of Uncle Pame, Felix of Ranchi Basti, Pinto the boatman, Shiva the other boatman, Chandrasekhar Kumar the policeman, Michael Ross the British photographer, the balding middle-aged Jarawa tourist from a respectable middle-class Indian family, Basu the politician, Seema, David, Justice Singh. This world knew, but it was refusing to see. The other original islanders, the Onge and the Great Andamanese, who had cohabited these forests with the Jarawas, had all but gone. The Jarawa were now being dragged down the same path. There was the evidence and the weight of history. The Jarawa would be pushed down the road to annihilation. That was the word David had used in their very first meeting. What do the annihilated feel? That was not the question Harish wanted to ask. What does the annihilator feel? How would he himself feel when the Jarawa were no more? Not because he wanted them to be vanquished, but because he could do nothing about their slide into oblivion. The world he belonged to did not want to annihilate the Jarawa, but it did not seem to know better. That was the tragedy, and Harish felt he had some idea of what could be done, at least what he wanted to do, or where he could perhaps start. A few days ago, the immensity of this responsibility would have overawed and perhaps paralyzed him, but this was a different Harish now.
And you're saying it's not a memoir or an autobiography.
I mean, my voice is choking. I mean, I must admit, that has been the struggle. That has been the emotional turmoil, in a sense. So in that sense, yes, it's a memoir, and you put me in a real tough spot by identifying that page 237. But yeah, so.
The Harish who went from Hyderabad of the four.
No, it's actually not, in that sense, it's not me. I mean, Harish is not me, but yes, it draws upon, there are many other characters whom Harish is based on, but yes, it's also, in that sense, a personal journey. In that sense, it's a personal quest, which I draw upon to, and I'm sure many people will identify with these questions.
No, and I think you've been unsuccessful at keeping the emotion out.
In the book.
Which you said you tried very hard to do, but I'm not sure you really wanted to. And
yeah, in the sense, a book without any, like yesterday there was, in the conversation, this friend very kind of asked, why is there a love story in this book? And I mean, I said, have you not been in love, Sohail? So how can there not be love in a story about human beings? So of course there has to be emotion, and there has to be, and that is what's going to grip people. That's what people are going to relate to, because in some senses it's about us as well. So I mean, this passage that you asked me to read, I'm sure all of us in different ways feel about different situations, different contexts. Maybe the degrees might be different, but this is what we will relate to. And I think in that sense, putting oneself in the spot helps to link. Yeah.
Connect, where is this? Okay. Did you actually connect this at the end of the book when...
Don't reveal the ending.
the love that gets washed away, and the Jarawa community, which perhaps is on the wane. Does it have any relation?
Okay, let me answer this way by saying that this book was actually kind of initial title that we were thinking of was, I was thinking was calling it Crossroads. Because what the story was and still is an account of being at the crossroads. And there were multiple, we all are at some crossroads, the same crossroads all the time or different crossroads all the time. I mean, we're always at crossroads. So this was for me also an account of, at one point, because it was post-tsunami, the islands were at crossroads because so much had happened. The Jarawas also, for various reasons historically, have been at crossroads. And these characters in the book also are at personal crossroads, emotionally, professionally. So, I mean, in that sense, yes, but but that's that much, because I don't want to say more either about the story or about even in general. I don't want to generalize more than that, or make it more specific actually, on the other hand. So it is about, like the passage I read is about the interfaces of two sets of people trying to interact, forced interaction, but also about being at crossroads, because we are dealing with this, whether in the administration, whether in professions, whether in personal lives. That is, in a sense, the journey of the human experience. I mean, that's what our lives are. I've come to realize, just negotiating stuff like that all the time. You had something. Yes.
Jarawa is the only one which is left, which has actually not integrated with mainstream this. So I was curious to know from your understanding of the Jarawa community as to why is this resistance towards integration with the rest of the inhabitants. Secondly, I mean, I see a lot of similarity with the Aboriginal communities in Australia and how this forced kind of mainstream conversion has led them to also alcoholism and all the social evils. And I guess that's also happening here because they are in a way forced to change their ways and means. So, I don't know, I mean, speaking for, as a third person for activists, can we see a system wherein the activists can actually make those crossroads, trying to get some kind of mediation in getting the best things out of the Jarawa and the best things out of the mainstream communities to actually see where those linkages are and also help in integrating rather than resisting them from any changes whatsoever, because eventually it's a losing battle. Eventually, I mean, that's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, one way to answer the question is to kind of lay out a roadmap of sorts. Is to say, I agree with you, and what can be done, and perhaps, but I mean, in a sense, the last question that you asked, what can I really, it's not about what the Jarawas did or this exploration anymore for me now. And like I read in the passage, it's not really about why the Jarawas are resisting or what somebody else is doing. For me, and I think the book is an exploration about us and about me in a sense. So one can answer the questions in a sense of, okay, what should be done if the road is closed or not? How should we integrate the Jarawa? Should we? These are the debates that are happening in a sense. And I'm kind of resisting answering those in this forum in the context of the book, because I want to go beyond that, because those answers exist. I mean, there's a menu of options that one can perhaps offer, but also in a more obvious sense, how can we kind of broaden that and ask the larger questions and not get stuck in? So in a sense, okay, the activism, the research ends up about being those things. What the novel allows one to do is to step back a bit and allows the luxury of not seeking those immediate interventions. And I hope and I feel that if we also broaden that canvas, I keep referring to that 1964 document of India, Government of India, which repeatedly talks of colonizing the Andaman Islands. Colonizing the Andaman Islands. It refers to these forests as Jarawa infested forests. Government of India document of 1964. So, then why should we expect anything different from what has happened, whether the Jarawas or the other tribes? So, I want to kind of not respond immediately, and of course there is a menu, like I said, of options that can be exercised, and it's about our own humilities, our own sensibilities in some sense, and it's easy to say that in a book. I mean, I absolutely admit that, but what does it actually mean on the ground? What do you do when you say I have to negotiate fairly with the community that you can't even talk to? But at least, and if you stop looking at them or so many other communities, even in a Bangalore or different sets of communities, with the, and it's easier said than done. I mean, let me say that again and again. But how can we explore and reflect is what, and also, it's not just about the Jarawa and the indigenous communities. There's a whole other set of communities, which if you have time, maybe can I also just read one more little passage? Yeah, we're like 5 to 1. Yeah, we do. Yeah, because I want to do that because there's this whole community of the local bonds, which is a very interesting kind of community. And I'll read two short passages where Syed Iqbal and Lalita come in. And the local bonds are a community that is a very important part of the identity of the island. They are the descendants of those people who were imprisoned in the cellular jail and who chose not to go back when they were freed from the jail. Partly, some people didn't have an option. Some people chose not to go back. And what's interesting also is the cellular jail is so much an identity of the island. It's so much an icon in the Indian freedom struggle. But what we don't know is that only 25% of the people ever incarcerated in the cellular jail were political prisoners. 75% were there for all other kinds of crimes and stuff like that. So it's the structure of the national narrative of creating and recreating history. And like I've written, in the entire history of the Andamans, if you look at it, the tribal communities are footnotes. But and that history is 150 years old. It began, say, with the cellular jail, or a little earlier, say, with the first war of independence. But if these people have been there for 30,000, 40,000 years, if their history was to be written, we would be a footnote. So, how do you kind of reconcile that history has not been written, and maybe it can't be written in the form that we write history? But how do you kind of reverse that thing? And in that sense, the local bonds are an interesting place. So Seema, who's one of the key characters, is this local bond. And her great-great-grandparents, there was one guy called Syed Iqbal who came from Lahore, who came there on charges of murder of a village guy in his village because he had sexually molested his sister then. And he murdered that guy, and then he was sent to cellular jail. And then here he meets a lady called Lalita, a vivacious woman, who they fall in love with each other. She comes from somewhere in southern India as part of a freedom struggle. And then she's a descendant of this person. And Seema is another researcher, an anthropology student who was born in the islands, has gone to Delhi, and now she wants to do a PhD as an anthropology student. Her professor is very excited because he says, in the Andamans you have these enigmatic communities like the Jarawas. You should do a PhD on them. She's convinced she wants to do it on the local bonds. And there's a little passage here with which I'm not reading, but which the professor says, what is this local bond business? Who are these local bonds, and why do you want to study the local bonds? And she's very upset. She says, what do you mean, who are the local bonds? I am a local bond. I want to study my community. And that's how she decides to study. And then she comes back, and then suddenly she looks at her place and her islands and her people with a very different view. And so there are two passages, brief passages here. One is not so brief, where an old man in the community is now telling Seema the story of a place called Aniket, where she was born. And he's telling of the story of how that came to be. So this is that passage of the story that Ahmed Mia, the old man, has told Seema. So this is the 1 acre of land. So Syed Iqbal and Lalita have met, they have married, a child is conceived, and then they're released, and they're given 1 acre of land by the British to kind of start life anew. The 1 acre of land that Syed Iqbal and Lalita had been given to restart their lives could best be described as being nowhere. Some place that didn't yet exist, had no context, location, or identity. It was somewhere out there, a few kilometers from the jail, amidst the mighty rainforest. In those initial years, other couples too had been given similar plots of land. The situation soon became unmanageable, which in turn brought the deeply religious and God-fearing Lieutenant Albert William into the picture. A junior officer of the penal administration, Albert was given the responsibility of organizing and planning 2 settlements for the convicts and the nowhere land that had been allotted to them. William was a friendly officer, and unlike many of his colleagues in the islands, came to be loved by the local population. He, the convicts from the jail who were employed here as labor, and others, like Syed Iqbal and Lalita, who were now free, worked day and night to clear the mighty forests, construct houses, lay out the roads, and create basic infrastructure. As the work on these settlements gained momentum, as nowhere was slowly transformed to somewhere, a tangible place with the character and identity, William suffered a great personal tragedy. An undiagnosed fever engulfed his 2 daughters, Annie and Kate, twins, a little less than 3 years old. Within a few days, the girls had succumbed and were buried in the cemetery on Ross Island, located just across the channel of sea from Port Blair. There was nothing they could have done, and yet the couple could not forgive themselves. William and his wife Jane had the option of returning to the mainland or even to England. To leave their firstborns behind in this manner, however, would have been a greater sin than letting them die. They chose to stay on, absorbing themselves in the work at hand, working shoulder to shoulder with the others here, toiling tirelessly with their bare hands, seeking forgiveness and redemption. The new islanders soon had an opportunity to repay the debt and express their gratitude. When the first 20 families were to formally occupy their homes, they decided to name their settlement in the memory of the little departed souls. One was to be Annie, the other Kate. The Williams were overwhelmed, crying with joy and gratitude and sorrow. This perhaps was the forgiveness that they had been seeking. Strange indeed were the ways of the Lord. We are extremely grateful for this honor, Albert William explained, but we cannot accept this. It would not be right. We do not wish to impose ourselves on so many new lives and futures. For those beginning these new lives, this was not an imposition. It was a choice they had willingly made. It was Lalita who spoke on behalf of all who had gathered. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, you are making a mistake. We are not asking for your consent. We are merely informing you. We have made the decision and you are not at liberty to change it. Our settlements will be known as Annie and Kate. She spoke with firmness, yet her words were gentle, filled with fond affection. And so it was decided. Over time, the settlements grew substantially, moving towards the crest of the ridge that separated them. The 20 families each grew in due course to 40 and then quickly to 100. With time, the physical boundaries between Annie and Kate blurred even more. Now, these were not two settlements, but one single place people started referring to as Annie or Kate, or as in the Hindi conjunction. In due course, the conjunctions also perished. Annie and Kate were themselves forgotten, and there were no more ceremonies on their death anniversary. Smoothly, like the natural confluence of streams that turn into a larger flow, their destinies, identities, and existence merged, just as they had with the very earth of the islands. The two settlements of Annie and Kate became one, the vernacular Aniket, the name for the wanderer, the one without a home. So Aniket was the place that Seema was born, and this is the story. And let me also take the liberty of reading the subsequent passage, and then, which is, Seema is completely blown by the story of Aniket, where she has been born, which Ahmed Mia has told. And she has a conversation now with Ahmed Mia. So Seema had known Ahmed Mia since she was a child, and he had always been fond of her. And he was one guy who had actually seen the Albert Williams. He's really, really old, so he knows that generation. It had never crossed her mind till now that he might have things to say that she might want to know, because she's looking at her own community again in a different way. How many more such stories are there in Port Blair? What have you been doing all these years, Ahmed Mia? Why don't you do something about these stories? She asked, exasperated. Do you want to take all of these to your grave with you? Grave? He smiled a sad, toothless smile. My time will come too. That's not what I meant, Ahmed Mia. Can anything or anyone escape that? He went on. A man takes nothing but himself to the grave. But, he said, turning to Seema, an earnest, even confused look on his face. Tell me, Beti, who is interested in the islands, in what happened here, in people like me? And he paused for a moment. And do you know how many people have asked me about this in the last 40 years? He paused again before answering his own question. One. His finger was pointed at Seema. You. Where were you all these years? I am too old now. If I had known you were interested, I would have put them all down. But tell me, really, is anyone interested? But Ahmed Mia, Seema tried to answering. Someone's interest does not decide the significance of these things. It may not matter to others, but does it not matter to us? To you? Should it not? Is this not like a line in stone, as real as the bones of Annie and Kate? Nobody sees it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Nothing can erase it, rain or wind or shine. Ahmed Mia burst out laughing. He got up with a sense of mock urgency. I need to go and see your father. I have to ask him what he's created. You've surely got a lot of that Lalita's blood in you. You've become a philosopher, my little one. Then just as suddenly he stopped laughing. Maybe, Beti, he said, it's too late. What was being done all these years? It could have been a question to Seema, but more likely he was seeking answers from himself. Do something, Seema, he said after a pause. Make a trip to Ross Island. You know the old cemetery there by that crumbling church building. Check the corner near the big banyan tree. That is where Annie and Kate were buried. William Sahib had put two identical gravestones there. Those might still be there. You'll know then that the story of Aniket is true. The proof exists. You are proof enough, Ahmed Mia, said Seema. I'll sit with you. You tell me everything that happened and I'll take it all down. But Ahmed Mia had been right when he said it was too late. He made a peaceful departure the very next afternoon during his regular midday nap. Seema had been right too. He took all he knew with him to his grave. Thank you. Yes, there are copies. So that's also the story of so much more about the islands than just Jarawa. And it was eerie because I wrote this story about Syed Iqbal and Lalita just as an anecdote, pretty much as a kind of imagination and idea. And I went this time to the islands and I met the curator of the National Memorial, who's a lady called Rashida Iqbal, who's just finished her PhD in history. And she looked at up to about 1937 or something, how people understood. Her father came from Peshawar, and Ainullah Khan, who came there on criminal charges. He met a South Indian woman, a Mopla Muslim, who came as part of something else. They got married there, and that's how she was born. It was just so eerie. And I mean, the sense is not because there are many stories like that. It was really nice is her father was a taxi driver, both in Peshawar and then in Port Blair. And she had his driving licenses. So 1937 driving license of Ainullah Khan with the photograph. And then it's a nice photograph with the signature. And she so proudly folded it open and then the 1947 or 48 Government of India driving license for Ainullah Khan in Port Blair. So there's so much, and I can see why then they relate to the book, because in some senses it tells stories which of those people that has not been told. And I don't. Sorry? It was actually not about the forest alone. It's about, actually these are people outside, these are people who destroyed the forest in a sense. But there is a sense of identification and sense of more stories, more narratives, parallel worlds, intersecting worlds kind of thing. Sure, of course.
But you say, what am I doing? You know, I should be doing something else or connect. What is the process of just writing this down?
I think I wrote it as a kind of, I think the only way I can describe it is as a very personal, emotional journey of writing. So I didn't really have these kind of writer's blocks kind of thing, but I worked in a particular way, which might be partly as because of being a journalist or so, you know, these kind of moody swings of writing and non-writing all doesn't work for me. I think it works for a lot of writers. I pretty much, how I wrote the book, and actually also I've just been finishing a PhD now and I'll be done in a couple of months. How I've written the entire thesis is a very kind of structured 3 hours every morning kind of working on what I want to write. And so it's actually also been at some point the process of writing. I've forgotten the story. I've just gotten into the mode of enjoying the writing. And you know, this you do read about stories telling themselves, and you know it's really true. Stories make you a means of telling themselves. I really can't describe it in any other way. You start with something and it just takes off, and those are the passages that sometimes are the most evocative. So I think there's a mix and match of everything. Sometimes nothing turns up. Sometimes you have to sit and really to be authentic. You have to refer. You have to bring in the references, even in novel writing. Sometimes it just flows. And for me, I think the story has been important, but I really enjoy the act of writing. And that is kind of a saving grace, because even if nothing productive, in a sense, within a frame emerges, you just kind of like the way the words play out, the way the ideas play out. They play with you, and it becomes a kind of very fascinating kind of experience. And what a friend told me when I was saying this, he said, this is a kind of Riyaz kind of writing, which to some extent I identify with that. There's a compulsion to write, and when I don't do that, I feel little something's missing. And when I get back, I like, the day really goes well when I've put those 2.5 hours in the morning trying to write. Even if I write nothing, that trying to write makes me feel, okay, I've done something. When I'm doing that, now life is kind of doing something else. But I've been talking to writer friends and all that, and they say we start at 6 in the morning, and then sometimes we end up at 12 at night, and we are still writing, and we're still energetic and enthused. And I can never do that. I get exhausted after 2.5 hours, and I have to do something else. I have to go and play with my child or do something completely different. So it's just completely different ways that people write. Yeah. And I hope some of you all write. Yeah. I mean, just so many fascinating stories to be told in different forms, and also, I mean, like the lady said, various forms of communication and engagement. Anyway, thank you so much for having me here. And